Hello and welcome to the Django GraphQL Query Fundamentals course. My name is Xander. This tutorial is part of a whole course playlist available for free on YouTube. For deeper learning, the extended course is available for purchase at Udemy. Now you'll find all the resources and links in the video description. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for weekly promotions, discounts, and Udemy course giveaways. Before we take a look at the last type of relationship that we can model, a one-to-one relationship between models, in this tutorial we're going to look at how to control field behavior in Django models, specifically using options like default, blank, null, and unique. So these settings help define how data is handled, whether a field is required, if it can be left empty, or if it should have a default value or it must be unique. So we're going to take a look at these four field options, default, blank, null, and unique. So let's start with default. Right, so far we have created some fields and we've defined the data types associated to those fields. So we're expecting to populate those fields with specific data types. Now, you imagine, for example, we go ahead and add a new product to our product table. Sometimes there may be a need for us to set a default value. In Django, you can use default to automatically assign a value to a field if no value is provided. So take a look at the products table here. We have an isActive field. So this allows us to specify whether the product is active or not. So in the context of our application here, that could mean we can soft delete a product so that it is no longer viewable by a customer. So we could set the isActive to false, and that would then set the product. So like I said, the product would then not appear on maybe the customer's screen. Now imagine if we wanted to set up a new product, what would probably be a good practice would be to set the product to false unless we explicitly specify that we're ready to make the product active. We may be adding products to our database and we're still just preparing the data before it goes live. So having this option isActive, false, or true will enable us to enable or disable the product from view. So when setting default values, we obviously need to be careful to make sure that we set a value that is relevant to the data type associated to that field. So here we're going to set isActive. We're going to set the default to true. So that means that if we don't specify this value when we add a new product record in this case, then this is going to be the default value that's going to be applied. So we can do the same for isDigital. So let's turn that to, well, let's change them both to false. So the default option if we don't specify will be false. So when we create a new product and don't specify isActive or isDigital field value, then that's just going to be automatically set to false. So we can do the same thing here. Maybe there's some sort of a default value we can add here. Now this is a string, so we need to be careful to make sure we match the type of data that's expected in this field. So we can just say no description. So this will be a default string that will appear in the description field for a new product if we were not to include it when we created a new product. Now, where exactly you use this will obviously depend on your own business logic, your application logic, but hopefully you've got the basic principles here. It allows us to create a default value, which will be automatically assigned to the field if no value is provided when we create a new record for any of our tables. Okay, so next up is blank and null. Now, when working with text fields in Django, like character fields or text fields, it's important to understand how to handle empty values. Now, if you have some of the different extensions that we discussed at the start of the course turned on, you might be able to hover over, if you haven't already seen this already, hover over the different data types, the different field types, and you can see an overview of all the different options that we have here for this particular field. and we can see some of the default values in actual fact. So here, if we move down, you can see that null by default is set to false. So the character field, by default, null is set to false. And that means that if we were to try and add a new product record to the product table and we forget to include the name field or data for the name field, it means that the default value null is false, which means it will not allow us to insert a new product record because we have to populate all the fields where null equals false. Now, there are some occasions where you want to make sure that fields are or can be set to false. Let's imagine, for example, the user table here. Let's imagine that we had, for example, a field called personal preferences or hobbies. Not all customers want to fill that in, of course. So there will be occasions where you want to allow blank fields. Now, if you want that, then you need to just specify null equals true. And in this case, it will override the default settings for the character field, which was false. You can now see it's been changed to true because we've specified true there. And that is how we're going to allow blank or null values in our field. Now we have the second option, which is blank equals true. So blank is a Django option, and this allows forms in the Django admin to accept it as empty. And then Django will save it as an empty string and not a null value. So here, what we can do is apply, for example, blank true. So this means that when we use the Django admin to actually create some new product data, it's going to allow us to define this field as blank. If we didn't include this option, and even though we set null true, Django would still expect us to populate this field in the admin to insert data. So we need to make sure that blank is true and null is true. That's, of course, assuming that we want to insert data from the Django admin or use the Django admin to control form data in some way. Now, what would be a really good idea for you to do is just to double check the fields if you're trying to determine whether they are default false or not. If you just hover over them, if you have this capability, you can look through the different data types and view the default behavior. You can see that most of the fields by default are set to null false, meaning that they will need to be populated when we insert data, in this case, into the product table. So again, that is something that you will need to specify within your models, and whether you set fields to null or not, that is obviously going to be dependent upon your particular database setup and your business logic. You simply need to ask yourself the question, when inserting data into my model, say the products table, does the data need to be included for the field in order to successfully create a new product record or not? If the answer is yes, then obviously we want to keep null to false. If, for example, here the description, if that's not a requirement, then we're going to set the description to null true to allow this field not to be populated when we insert a new product. Right, so last of all, we have unique. So this is going to help ensure that all values in this field are different across every row in the table. We have already learned that the primary key is a unique value that we uniquely identify a record. And we know that it's auto-incrementing, so every time we add a new record in the database, it will auto-increment, thus ensuring that there is a unique value in every single row in this column throughout the whole database. So if we were to specify this field name to be unique, it just means that every single record in this table, in this column, needs to be a unique name. Really simple to apply unique to a field. We simply assign the field option unique true. So this tells Django to enforce uniqueness, in this case to the field name, meaning again, no two rows in the table can have the same name or same value for the name. Okay, so there we have it, some additional options. Here we've covered how to use the default option to set initial values automatically, how blank and null control whether a field is required, and how unique helps enforce data uniqueness in our models. Now, understanding these options give you better control over how data is handled and validated, both in your code and in your database.